This video is about how people rise into the elite and get the most highly paying jobs. Hello, my name is Jouni Vilkka and this is my channel TFF, Teacher from Finland. In case you didn't figure it out, I'm a teacher from Finland. This time I'm trying to do something a bit different from what I usually do, but I have this series of videos based on various papers that I wrote as a student at several different universities. The difference here is, there are many differences, but the most obvious difference is that usually I wrote my essays in Finnish because I was going to Finnish universities. But this time I wrote this essay in English. The title of this essay is It's Who You Know, Entering the Elite Class Network. There are chapters titled The Importance of Networks, The Significance of Class Background, Class and Education, Being Accepted to an Elite University, The Goal, Acquiring an Elite Job, Discrimination by Gender, Race and Class Background. So obviously this paper is about class, education, getting a good job, that sort of thing. So are you interested in such things? Then begin reading the introduction. We can see that the very first line of the introduction goes like this. In this essay, I will explain what is required of an individual to enter the elite in society. And then I go on, but this first sentence is crucial. It is the main question of the whole paper. And that my main sources for this essay are Lauren Rivera's study of American elites, published as Pedigree: How Elite Students Get Elite Jobs. A book I highly recommend, by the way. It's available, for example, at Google Books. And Mike Savage's work on British elites, published as Social Class in the 21st Century. But you can see from this already that these two books, one based on a study about American elites and the other about British elites. So these are the main books that this essay is based on. So this is really about elites in those countries. The points I'm making in this paper should not perhaps be generalized to other countries. I think they actually can probably, but we don't have here evidence to support that. So it's probably going to be similar in different countries as well. Also, when you look at the publication dates, Rivera's book is from 2016 and Savage's book is from 2015. So these are not old. By this time one would expect that there's more recent research also available, and especially articles. But anyway, this is not published like a scientific article. This is an essay for my university studies. Pretty normal for essays for university courses. You know, the number of books and articles, that sort of thing. The length might not be. I did not ask intentionally what the required length for an essay in this department would have been, because those may be different from department to the next. This is 24 pages of text. Usually at least in Finnish universities, in my experience, papers written for courses are supposed to contain about 12 pages of text. I'll try to say something about each of the chapters in this essay, just in case you're not interested in reading the whole thing. So, the importance of networks. This chapter talks about networks in a general sense, just based on network theory. And at first I mention the barrier effect, which means that people can be separated from other people because of geographical or social location. Well, if you are an American, you live in the US, you probably don't know anyone from Botswana. You might, but the odds are small. More importantly, in this, for the purposes of this paper, your social location also matters, but we'll get back to that. Also, in network theory, they talk about leaders in a different sense from what might be usually understood. So leader is an ethic term. Anyway, they make a distinction between ethic, which is the point of view of the researcher, and emic, which is how the people themselves, the insiders in the culture or organization or any kind of group, how they talk about something. So, for example, a person who is some kind of a coordinator might, be called a coordinator within, say, a big corporation. The people there call that person a coordinator, but the researchers might notice that this person actually fulfills the role of a leader in a sense. So in research papers they would call that person a leader. A person who is a leader in this sense, this ethic sense, typically is in a position to connect various segments of a network. So creating basically a network. There are like two different networks of people, and someone there in one of these, for example, is such that they are also connected to the other network. So these networks become connected because of this one person, making that person rather important for both of those otherwise separate networks. So this actually brings me to the old adage kind of referred to in the title of the paper. It's not who you are, it's who you know. So in the title I use the latter part, it's who you know. The point being, it's not always that important who you are or what you can do, that sort of thing, but just who you know happens to be really important. And making connections can happen in many ways, just randomly happening to be in the right place at the right time. For example, children typically form friendships easily, because of where they live or where they go to school, for example. So they're classmates. This actually is the reason why in Finland in the 70s we formed a school system where the whole point was that everyone basically goes to the same kinds of schools, so that there are no elite schools for the kids of the elites, and this creates a more equal society, maybe. That was the idea anyway, and it's actually worked pretty well. It's one of the reasons why Finnish educational system became some years ago big news all over the world because we were doing so well in the PISA study. This way of forming basically haphazard connections to other people is called propinquity. There's another phenomenon called homophily. So that means love of the same, meaning people like people who share similar features, characteristics, interests, and they are typically connected, and people tend to associate with others like themselves, and this becomes really important for the point of this paper. There are social networks. Usually these are informal networks, so there are no bosses there, but there may be leaders in the aforementioned sense. There's also a phenomenon that Kadushin calls keeping up with the Joneses, which means that for some reason people think it's important in general. I don't think this applies to me, by the way, but in general people need to keep up with their peers, and that's important because normal people do not envy Elon Musk, for example, for his wealth. I mean, they might dream about having that sort of wealth, but they are not actually envious. But apparently it is important, it's a big deal, if your coworker is paid 10% more than you are. So you might actually envy that coworker who isn't really that much richer than you are, while some other people are making billions. To me, it is kind of strange, because maybe it's because I've never been much interested in money. I've never been motivated by money. But maybe there are other things that also function the same way, although I really don't feel envy. I can't imagine that, actually. Anyway, the last point about this connection chapter. White-collar jobs are more often found through so-called weak ties rather than strong ties. And the reason for that is simply because the strong ties are people like your family, your friends, your really close friends, and you are likely to share the same knowledge. You know most of the same people, perhaps, as your family members and as your best friends. But so, you know, any opportunity that presents itself to anyone within your circles, all of the people in the same group know the same thing pretty quickly. So, for example, job openings are not likely to be found there, but it's the weak ties, the people that you might know through a common interest, a hobby or something, that sort of thing, that connects you to someone who then, in a similar way, perhaps is connected to another person who may be a CEO in a company where they need people like you. So you might get that white-collar job because of you have a friend of a friend, something like that, a weak tie. That is why these really wide networks are at least useful, if not necessary, for making a career, so to speak. Chapter 3 is about the significance of class background, and the Marxist theory that you probably know about talks about class on the basis of what the relations of production are. So there's the capitalist class, who basically own everything, and then the working class, who only own their own labor and have to sell that. And the state acts to at least a major degree in the interests of the ruling class, so not the whole society. And whereas for Marx the ruling class was the bourgeoisie, that's not necessarily the case anymore. At least it's analyzed in a much more complex manner in this chapter as well. It's important to note that social class is still the cause of great differences in incomes, wealth, status, education, and lifestyle, which all reflect a person's social class. There can never be an equality between different social classes in a capitalist economy and society, because capitalism is defined as the exploitation of one class by another. So the capitalists exploit the workers. But in these more recent analyses, there are different strata among the working classes, but while there are these strata, these classes still are working classes and share interests between them, kind of opposed to the ruling classes. Savage, one of these authors, talks about the 1% movement, the Occupy movement. A little bit mentions it maybe, but his elites, his term elites, what he's interested in is not that 1%, but more closer to 6% of the population. So a broader wealth elite, one that actually might seem attainable to us, unlike the very top riches, the 0.1% or less, people like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos and that sort of thing, the super rich. The 6%, the broad like normal elite, is far more attainable, and this video is sort of about how to attain that position. So class in this new view that is that Savage presents is based on 3 types of capital. So not just money, but there are 3 types of capital: economic, cultural, and social capital. But these types of capital are connected. So people have some amount of each of those forms of capital. And there are a total of 7 classes in this system, in this analysis. On the top is the small elite, who are way better off than the rest. So they are clearly separate. And then on the bottom there's the precariat, those who score lower than others in relation to all 3 types or kinds of capital. And the 5 other classes are there in the middle. But these forms of capital tend to accrue in a certain way, so that, for example, the wealthiest 20% are the most likely to inherit at all, and they are also likely to inherit largest sums of money, whereas the precariat probably don't inherit anything, or if they happen to inherit something, it's just a small amount of money. So, the rich get richer or something. Also, age is significant. One tends to be better placed to accrue certain types of capital at different stages of life. And since they all are typically accumulated over time, the elite class tends to be older than the others. So over time they accrue more capital of various kinds and get older, but amass more and more of that capital. So those on the top are the ones who spent most time accruing it. Kind of interestingly, Rivera notes that class is a dirty word in the US, where people mistakenly believe that there is a lot of mobility, social mobility, within the American economic class structure, more than there is. There is some, but not as much as people think. And this is because of a kind of psychological bias called availability heuristic. Since people know someone who made it from rags to riches, then it's easier for them to imagine that happening, and then they think that anyone can basically do that, which is at the very least an overgeneralization. So of course, even in the most rigid societies there is some amount of mobility between the classes, because that is required for the system to have any kind of legitimacy. Otherwise, without this kind of at least small movement or mobility between classes, the whole system might be threatened. For example, Americans, because they mistakenly believe that there is more mobility than there is, that itself is kind of a reason why there still is as little mobility as there is, and why Americans don't basically riot more. For Rivera, the elites are defined as individuals who have greatly disproportionate control over valued and scarce resources. And there are three types of elites. There are economic, educational, and occupational elites. These are similar to the analysis of Savage earlier. What Rivera does not talk about at all in her book is what Savage notes about the UK. The fact that in the UK the new elite has a distinctive geography. It is a central urban class, which is kind of interesting. Might be interesting to know what the situation is in the US. If you happen to have any information about this, leave a comment about that below. Anyway, for Savage, there are two types of valuable cultural capital. Highbrow cultural capital is the older sort of culture that is associated with theater, the opera, classical art, culture of old people basically. And then there is the emerging cultural capital of the young, or at least younger people. But curiously, it is the highbrow capital that is very much connected to self-confidence, and it is usually considered to be good taste as opposed to other forms of culture, and its proponents even take this for granted, whereas the proponents of other styles of culture consider taste to be a subjective matter and certainly wouldn't just blatantly claim to have good taste or to condemn someone else for having bad taste, as this old guard will do. And the highbrow cultural capital is connected to class. Those who possess it benefit from this background in that they are and exude a self-confidence which is typically expected, especially for example in applying for white-collar elite jobs. So, specifically the elite jobs, they might expect a certain amount of self-confidence. Personally, I think that's a mistake, and it's typical of people to make that mistake because they assume that self-confidence means something that it doesn't, because self-confidence has nothing to do with how knowledgeable or how good a person is. And in fact, as pretty much everyone by now should know if they follow social media at all, is the phenomenon known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. So that basically people who think they are very good at something tend to be the people who actually are not, or at least people who know a little about something think they know a lot about it, whereas people who know significantly more are far better aware of how little they know. And then the real experts also have a better understanding of how much they know. They still know that they need to know more, but they realize that they know more than the average person. But that takes real expertise, like in the academic world, that's like PhD level and above. So if you've read an article or two about something and you think you know what that something is about, if you really think at this point that you know enough, then you really don't know anything. Anyway, let's get back to the paper. So cultural capital can make a career, unfortunately, especially in the sense that a cultural interest can connect you to, through a hobby or sport or whatever, to the right person, as I mentioned in the previous chapter. For example, a supervisor or an interviewer can lead, if you know them, that can lead to an advancement in your career, even within the university system. The weird thing about this new elite class is that it is aware of how different it is from other social classes, but seeks to avoid overly snobby eliteness, while also recognizing its own importance. So members of this elite think that they have earned their place through hard work and whatever merits, and at the same time they also think that they are ordinary people in some way. And the issue of keeping up with the Joneses is really big among these people as well. Wealthy people also know several people of high status occupations typically, and they are therefore kind of like leaders in the ethics sense, and this means that it's easier for them to be aware of all these opportunities within wider circles. So it's social capital that they have. The elite occupations are also the most socially exclusive. So it forms a class of its own, which is difficult to enter and has political significance, as Savage acknowledges. What we are now seeing is an effective and powerful wealth elite who, broadly speaking, are highly engaged politically and know how to lobby at one extreme, and the precariat who are largely alienated from mainstream party politics at the other. In the next chapter, I'm going to talk about how universities are important in creating connections and that sort of thing. The more educated you are, the more likely you are to know professionals who might help you on your career. It is commonly assumed or accepted that education plays an important part in the job market. But it might not be understood exactly how that happens. So, social class has an effect also on one's educational career, if you will. Social class affects one's reading age, so when you start reading, grades and entrance to higher education. What is kind of disheartening is that teachers teach people from different backgrounds in different ways. There's a hidden curriculum in schools, and it is connected to social class. It implicitly trains school students from different economic and social classes to different economic and social futures. So your past or your parents' class, if not determines, at least affects your future class. Bourdieu noted how schools recognize and reward middle class and upper class knowledge, language, body language, and diminish and demean working class and some minority ethnic cultures. So this is part of the hidden curriculum. Types of cultural capital that schools privilege and validate are not familiar to lower class children, ethnic minorities, or immigrants. So schools are middle class institutions run by and for the middle class, for the most part, according to Bourdieu. According to Rivera, in US, 80% of individuals born into the top quartile of household incomes will obtain bachelor's degrees, while only about 10% of those from the bottom quartile will do so. So that's a pretty significant disparity. The class of one's parents apparently really significantly affects the level of education achieved. Things are pretty different in Finland in this regard because, for one, we don't really even talk about bachelor's degrees, not a lot anyway. In Finnish university system, traditionally we have been, so for decades, the assumption has always been when you start studying in a university, you study to the master's level. The bachelor's degree has become a more common thing. I mean, it is a step on the way to master's, but it wasn't even necessary in the beginning of the century, for example. So 20 years ago, it wasn't yet a thing. but because of the Bologna process in Europe, bachelor's degrees became mandatory in something like 2005 maybe, and nowadays it's, I guess, somewhat common, or at least possible, for people to just get a bachelor's degree and not study to the master's. But most who get the bachelor's degree in Finland also continue to the master's. Anyway, according to Rivera, over half of the students at top-tier business and law schools come from families from the top 10% of incomes nationally. So specifically this type of schools and the very top schools there are the ones that attract basically the people from the richest families. Kind of interesting. And it shows a class structure at work. The inequality in education in American schools begins, according to Rivera, already in public primary and secondary schools because of the, in my opinion, very weird and unfair funding system that is based on the region's property values. So basically wealthy neighborhoods will get more funding for schools in those neighborhoods, whereas poor neighborhoods will have to do with less funding. So that perpetuates clearly a class difference. Selective college admissions committees, a thing in the US, prefer students from schools with strong reputations for academic excellence. So connected with the previous point, this means that students who study at wealthy schools that are sort of schools with good reputations because they get more funding, the students there are more likely to do well at school. So the school in general does well, and because of that, so because of the students, the school becomes considered a good school. It has a good reputation, whereas poor neighborhood has that poorly funded school where the people who otherwise also may have more difficulties in life, not getting a lot of funding, they are not likely to do as well at school. There is much less support for them. So these students will not be doing well in general, or not as well anyway. So the school will have a bad reputation. So even if you do well while attending a school that has a bad reputation, you will be disadvantaged when trying to apply to a university because you have not attended a school with a good reputation. Whereas someone who doesn't really do very well at school but happens to be living in a good neighborhood, or manages to go to a well-funded school that has a good reputation, they can use that good reputation of the school that they attended as a way of getting ahead. So it's unfair, clearly, and certainly has nothing to do with their personal merits. Rivera also mentions some ways in which the parents can help and benefit their kids. So basically, the parents who can afford it, who can financially support their children who are studying at university, for example, make it possible for the student, the children, to not work for a living, so they can concentrate on academic achievement, or they can accept unpaid internships, or they can simply network and make friends, which later on might really become useful when they benefit from the networks they have created. Also, the parents' social networks, so social capital, can be useful in getting applications accepted. So applications to universities or employment or whatever. Also, the friends and study buddies or other acquaintances can provide the student with useful motivation, tips, advice, things that will benefit the student. So if they have these useful connections, these networks, they will benefit from these, not just when they are trying to apply for a job, but also during their studies. And Rivera doesn't even mention the fact that obviously people can also really concretely help their friends in things like moving, or even stuff like homework or preparing for a presentation, very concrete stuff. So social networks are also useful that way. The cultural type of capital that the kids have kind of like inherited from their parents. They've grown up into the culture of their parents, so they have accrued some amount of cultural resources. So these also influence and may be beneficial, possibly in some cases harmful, but the good kind of cultural capital can be useful for the children also when they are, for example, trying to get a job, an elite job at a prestigious company, let's say a law firm or something, because they have the right tastes, values, interaction styles, modes of self-presentation, behaviors. These are all class-based differences, and they are helpful. So if you are born into a family that has a lot of cultural capital, so basically that highbrow old people's capital, then that can really be useful when trying to get the kind of job that you might want. There is also in the US an interesting phenomenon that Rivera mentions, which is that there are test prep courses commercially available. So basically that's only available to the affluent or those who have enough financial capital. But these are not just available in the cities, but interestingly, these are also available in places where the rich or wealthy families have vacation homes. So some entrepreneurs have really found a useful niche to take advantage of. But this means that only the wealthy have access to these services. And that will help them to get their kids into elite schools, elite universities, which is the subject of the next chapter. Chapter 5 is about being accepted to an elite university. In the US, tertiary education is critical for stable employment and economic security, according to Rivera, and I think that's pretty clear, while also being among the most expensive educations in the world. Here in Finland, we don't have to pay for university education, so the US system seems very strange, unfair, even cruel, and counterproductive even. Anyway, how to get into an elite university? It helps if your parents, or one parent at least, has attended that same university. That is called a legacy. Apparently in US universities, just having someone in your family attend a university is considered kind of a merit for you, and you might get accepted because of that. Donations also pave the way, so having wealthy parents is useful again. Besides these things, extracurricular achievements are also something that Rivera talks about quite a bit. So these are things like successful career in sports or other strange achievements that you can talk about. I think a big part of what makes an achievement is how you dress it up, how you present your achievement. So if you climbed Mount Everest, that's probably pretty good in itself. But if you didn't quite do that, but you did something that perhaps you don't really think of quite as that great, you might still be able to present it in a way that makes it sound more interesting, and that might be helpful. But it's interesting also that it's no longer enough to just go to a university, not even an ancient or Ivy League university, at least not in the countries in question, in order to make it to the elite. So even the best universities are not enough for that. According to Savage, only 15% of graduates in these schools make it to the elite. So that's less than 1 in 6. About half of the graduates end up in the established middle class, which is one of the 5 middle classes in Savage's terminology. So practically none of the graduates fall into the precariat, which is kind of good news, I suppose, for the student. So studying is supposed to be kind of a protective factor, I guess, or at least was when Savage was doing his research. And there is a curious thing about the university system in the UK, at least, because again, according to Savage, if you want to get a PhD, you are advised to choose your university well, because recruiters target a limited set of universities. So if you go to the wrong university, the recruiters will not be interested in you. Simple as that. The graduates of elite universities tend to be high, both on economic and cultural capital, and they overrepresent, or they are overrepresented in the elite class. But those from high social class, so those who start high basically, don't necessarily need to go to the best, most prestigious universities. They don't need necessarily to have degrees from them in order to make it still to the elite. So they are way better off, I guess. There is this thing called educational homogamy, which means that people tend to, for example, marry people from the same group, the same university. For people who are similarly qualified, so people are likely to not marry out of their own class, which entrenches class divisions. Again, one of the things that is so wrong in American universities, as far as I can tell, according to Rivera's study, is that the quality of universities in US is measured by the starting salaries of their graduates, which has the counter, or at least from the point of view of science, in my opinion, counterproductive effect that it is in the best interests of those universities to guide their students into high-paying jobs, not science. So also, of course, in the US, where education is ridiculously expensive, the student is likely to have heavy student debts when they graduate. So they kind of have a lot of incentive to find themselves a really well-paying job. Also, elite firms throw lavish parties to entice students with a life of luxury at recruiting events, which are not free, or at the very least there's a social expectation for certain kind of clothing and that sort of thing. So these things require money, so the student is likely to get more debt to be able to attend, to participate in various events. And an explicit purpose of business schools, for example, is to provide opportunities for developing strong and wide social connections or networks. So we come back to the importance of networks that was mentioned pretty much in the beginning. What also helps students of elite universities to later on get an elite job is the fact that elite undergraduate institutions have pools of alumni the students may be able to call on to help them prepare for elite job interviews. And also there are former consultants at those schools that can be asked for help. But again, these are only in those specific elite schools. So if you don't attend the right schools, your chances of landing an elite job are pretty slim. And it has nothing really to do with your academic achievements. It's just whether you get the support or not. Chapter 6 is finally the goal, acquiring an elite job. So how do you get that? To rise to the elite, a job in the elite, so an elite job is clearly required. Rivera talks about EPS, or Elite Professional Service. So jobs from banks, consulting and law, which are also known as the Holy Trinity or Ivy League finishing schools, even though they are jobs, companies, firms. And in a similar way, the elite class occupational blocks in the UK, according to Savage, include banking, finance, business, media, law, academia. So it's more varied, I suppose. At this point, when these studies were done, technology companies were still just entering the fray. But the point is that all of these elite firms are recruiting from the same students, essentially. So from those elite universities mostly. In Rivera's book, in the title, there's the word pedigree, and it refers to a job candidate's record of accomplishments, which really just mostly means education and previous employment. So there's the idea or notion that their hiring decisions are based on actual individual merit, but that's not the case. The applicant's socioeconomic background has a huge impact. So the first part is the university that the applicant attended. So these EPS firms have their own preferences, which companies they want to hire from. And these are categorized to core, target and non-listed institutions. And it's pretty obvious that they want as many as possible of the people from the core universities. And then they try to recruit the best from the target institutions. And if you're not from one of those, then you have very little chances of advancing further. But there is a possibility, that is if you are sponsored. But without a sponsor, you're out of luck. The reason these EPS firms recruit from elite universities is that it's the easiest and least expensive way to find a lot of apparently good applicants. They believe that the best people can be found from these elite universities. They are the best and the brightest. So they think. Also, the prestige of the company itself is connected to how many people they can recruit from these best universities. So these EPS companies are actually competing for the graduates from these elite universities. What is really strange here is that they don't care at all what the students actually studied at the universities. The education is basically irrelevant. They think that because these now graduates were at one point admitted to those elite universities, they have to be really great. So as long as they got into those universities, it didn't matter what they did in those universities anymore. Also, the reason why they do this probably is that the whole process of hiring people in these EPS firms is completely unprofessional. That is, the interviewers in these interviews by these CPS companies are revenue generating professionals from those companies. They are not professional recruiters. So they are not even trying to look for the applicant best suited for the job. They probably wouldn't even know how to do that. So they tend to just look for the people with the best social, the right social background. They see the failure to attend a super elite school as an indicator of intellectual failure, regardless of the student's grades or standardized test scores. So they really don't care. As long as you got into the right university, that's all that matters. And if you didn't, you're not the right kind of person. If you did actually attend the right universities, then a lot of attention is put on what your extracurricular activities were. And those are really important. Seems like they are way more important than what you actually studied. Especially important is involvement in formalized, high-status leisure pursuits, which are signs of wealth and high social status or class. The preferred activities can also be described as upper and upper middle class white culture. So the recruiters think that these activities can be used to judge the candidate's sociability and well-roundedness, but it seems like these are actually just signs of something quite different. Here's a quote from Rivera. Those without significant extracurricular experiences or those who participated in activities that were primarily academically or pre-professionally oriented were perceived to be boring, tools, bookworms or nerds who might turn out to be corporate drones if hired. So the people who actually might have the real knowledge and skills are overlooked. Completely unfair. Instead, what matters is that you participated in the right type of sports, for example. Unfortunately for the working class students, they typically focus on academic achievement when they are studying at university, for example. And they might not have any extracurricular activities. So they might be nerds and bookworms, but they might know their shit. But that doesn't matter. These evaluators place the most emphasis on experiences that were strongly correlated with parental socio-economic status. Resume signals that are widely accessible, such as class rank at the university and the content of cover letters, are simply ignored. They don't even bother to check those. So this creates a barrier for students from less privileged backgrounds. They don't even get invited to the interview. These are private firms. So private firms can legally do whatever they want in how they hire people. It's just amazing that they do such an unprofessional job at it. Interviewers emphasize prior work prestige rather than the content of the job as well. So it matters where you worked, but not what you did or what you learned during your career in your previous employment. So presumably these interviewers think that there's some kind of an intelligence, and you working for example for their competitor is a good sign of that intelligence, and that's all that matters. Whereas I would think that there are probably more definitive skill sets that one could learn and acquire working at various firms, doing whatever. And those skills and that knowledge could be useful. But these interviewers are not interested in even looking for that sort of things. It's like they really don't know their shit. To get past this resume viewing and interview step, or those both steps, there is that one way that I alluded to in the beginning of the video actually, which is networks. So if you can call in a favor or ask for a favor from someone who matters, then that could be a way in. Because for these EPS firms, connections are more important than a good CV. So everything I said previously kind of doesn't matter if you just know the right people, right? So this is because hiring in these companies is a sponsored contest. That is, only the people who have good enough sponsors even have a chance. So you need to have the right social capital, the right network connections. If you happen to have really good connections, you might even bypass the whole process so far. You might just get past the interview and the CV and all that stuff. But only if you have really good connections. One way also is this thing called courtesy interview or courtesy hiring, because companies apparently at this level might do favors for their business partners. So they might allow someone to be interviewed for a job, or even they might hire someone just as a favor to someone else. So again, the person getting the interview or getting hired might have no merits basically. Or, probably they will require something, at least apparent merits, but clearly that's not what really matters. If it's basically a favor to a business partner. And of course afterwards these people will think that, especially years later when they have forgotten how they got into the company, they will think that it's because of their own merits. And that way they think that they have earned the high salary and whatever. In these interviews, cultural fit is the most important criterion, which again is questionable, because good answers in an interview show that the applicant has done her homework, as they put it, looked up information about the firm. But actually the information they require is something that requires the right connections to have access to. You can't acquire this information elsewhere. You can acquire it from the athletes and secret societies at elite universities. So that's the kind of people who get into these elite jobs as well. In these interviews, they favor certain interaction styles, and these are typical of American economically privileged people, members of the elite class. So as a child, you get socialized into a certain class, and basically if you are born into a high class family, or at least upper middle class family, then you will probably be socialized to behave in a certain way, how to interact with people and all that stuff. And this will be beneficial to you in an interview in one of these EPS firms. Also, they will ask you to tell stories about yourselves. And an effective story in an interview like this has to do with your own personal decisions. That is emphasized. How you made a difference somehow. And you have to emphasize intrinsic motivations, like you have a real drive for whatever the job is. And you shouldn't talk about wanting money, for example, even if you are neck deep in debt. One of the problems how this disadvantages people from low status, lower class, is that these people are likely to see professional and private life as separate spheres of life, and they don't want to mix these. And this is really a disadvantage for them, because this is exactly what is expected of them in these interviews. And it's a shame, because as Rivera says, they could benefit from their low class origins by telling a story in the style of rags to riches. So they could just tell a really good story about themselves, and that might get them selected actually, with a lot of luck. These evaluators prefer certain kinds of stories that have 4 significant socio-economic dimensions. First of all, it assumes that the candidate actually had a choice or choices, which really might not actually have been the case. 2. Research shows that choosing jobs and schools is an economically privileged way of perceiving life choices. People from low economic status don't get to choose jobs or schools. And 3. Psychological research shows that individuals from lower socioeconomic backgrounds tend to see their experiences as connected to others and external factors, exactly the sort of things that these people don't want to hear, because they only want to hear these individualistic stories. Narrative style that emphasizes individual choice, freedom, and distinctiveness is a more middle and upper class way of perceiving the world. So they want to select basically people who are middle or upper class people, even if they do it implicitly without realizing what they are doing. So 4, the idea that an individual controls one's fate is actually a very typically American way of framing the world. It is therefore disadvantaging people who come from different cultures or have different cultural background. And what's also interesting is that the advantages of the background don't just stop at getting the job, but continue on after that. So those who are in the best paid positions in many elite occupations actually come from the most advantaged backgrounds as well. Unfortunately, it goes without saying that there is discrimination by gender, race, and class background, and probably other things as well in this on this path to the elite. So trying to get into an EBS job, an elite job, will be more difficult for women, people who belong to minorities, and people with working class background. These people are unlikely to even be invited to a job interview actually. the reason for this discrimination is not that especially the companies would actually want that. It's not even that the interviewers are, for example, racist, but rather it is because they are unprofessional and they are unequipped to do a better job. Their only instructions are to consider themselves the measure of merit. So they are looking for people like themselves. So this causes an unintentional discrimination. The stereotypes affect in this process, in this evaluation, in especially ambiguous situations, because those who are negatively stereotyped might then not be considered for the job because of internal shortcomings, whereas others might explain them away with external factors. So this is actually a psychological bias at work again. Also, those who are invited to an interview will find, well, they won't be made aware of it, but the requirements for them will be different from those of white middle-class males. Women, for example, are required to show more empathic interaction than men. Black men are rejected for being unprofessional or immature, whereas white men with the same failings are only seen as needing more coaching for the second round of interviews, for example. In general, stereotypically masculine activities are considered making a greater fit for both men and women, but men will be penalized for feminine self-presentation styles, interests, and experiences. Sports for these interviewers are a big deal, and that's assuming that the sport is not too feminine, for example, because that would be bad. Entry into the elite is now more open and more formalized in an attempt to make it more fair. But the way these top-tier EPS firms select new members is causing social closure. So early life experiences and parental resources are still critical for later economic opportunities as well. Finally, we come to the last chapter, 8. So, what does it take? So, how do you get to rise into the elite? I only came across one surprise here, studying for this paper, and it is that amazing incompetence of the recruiters and the whole process, how incompetently it is done and how unqualified these people are to make the right recruitment choices. I mean, assuming that what the company desires is the actually best people, not just those who are from the right social circles. But if they don't care about skill, then I suppose it doesn't matter. This, of course, is from Rivera's work, so I don't know if it's even the case in the UK, but I suspect it is. This incompetence makes it possible, of course, for people with good social networking skills to land the job that they want, even if they lack in some other requirements. It's not who you are, it's who you know. It seems to be the most important thing. If you have friends in high places, in the right places, they can provide you with assistance for interviews. You get into the right universities, and you get you get to be invited to the elite job interviews, and you might even then get the elite job. It also really helps if you come from an elite background, obviously. So if you manage to attend an elite university, and before that an elite school, and before that an elite kindergarten, then you kind of have some kind of a chance to land the elite job as well. A scholarship based on athletic achievement would be helpful. It would probably be considered the right kind of merit by these incompetent reviewers. And the right extracurricular hobbies, of course. Those would help. And the higher the achievement, the better. So jobs or even unpaid internships at the most prestigious brand name companies, that's always good. One other option to get there, to get this elite job, is actually to start your own company and make it a successful one. Just, become a millionaire. That always works. So all the way up this ladder that you're climbing from childhood, basically, if you manage to create the right networks, you make the right connections, that will be very helpful. You get to call on the right people to get the needed advice, and maybe pull some strings otherwise. It would also be advantageous to be young, good looking, white and male. Those are apparently good qualities in a person. But before you apply for any of these EPS jobs, you might wanna rethink the whole thing, because there are some drawbacks to this. The educated elite has become a religion that promises identity, transcendence, and community. In order to reach fulfillment, massive amounts of work and work-related activities are necessary, according to a journalist, Derek Thompson. Entering the elite may be difficult, and it might turn out to be more than you bargained for.